My girlfriend walked up to me at my own family reunion in front of everyone and asked why I even bothered showing up, not knowing my cousins had been planning this moment for years. I almost dropped my lemonade. Selena and I had been together 2 years. She'd never once come to a family event. So when she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Why are you here?" I thought I'd misheard her over the noise of the sprinklers. "I'm surprised you're here," she repeated, slower this time, like she wanted me to feel every word. "I didn't invite you." The backyard went dead silent. My Aunt Denise froze mid-gossip, a paper plate of potato salad halfway to her mouth. My uncles stopped their cornhole game. 30 people turned and stared at us with these smug little smirks, like they'd all been waiting for a show to start. Then I heard it, that awful hyena laugh from the garage. My cousins, Grant, Wesley, and Preston, were doubled over, filming us on their phones. Selena pulled an invitation out of her purse. Same gold trim as mine. Same time, same address. 4127 Larkspur Lane, Millbrook. Same date, June 14th. Except hers was addressed to her, personally, at her apartment on Denton Street. "Someone sent this last week," she said quietly, her hands shaking just enough that the card fluttered. "It said I was specially invited to meet everyone, that you'd been talking about me for years and it was time." My blood went hot. I knew exactly who was behind this. These three had tortured me since I was 8 years old. Scooters into my ankles until I bled on my grandmother's driveway, thrown around like a toy while I screamed for my mom to come outside. Ghost peppers baked into my 13th birthday cake while everyone watched me cry into a napkin. In high school, they stole my girlfriend, passing her between themselves, sending me photos the whole time just to watch me break. In college, they drugged my drink at a family Christmas party and posted the video before I even woke up on the bathroom floor. Every complaint I filed disappeared because their fathers were cops in this town. Standing there with Selena humiliated in front of 30 relatives, something in me cracked clean down the middle. I shoved Grant into the garage door hard enough to rattle the hinges. "What sick game is this?" I shouted, and my voice cracked on the last word. Wesley smirked, arms crossed, not even bothering to stand up straight. "Relax, little cousin. Just having some fun." "Fun? You invited my girlfriend here to humiliate me?" Preston kept recording, grinning behind the camera like he was directing a movie. "You really want to know?" Grant asked, wiping a thin line of blood off his lip where it had hit the door frame. "Fine. You're dating your own cousin." The words hit like a truck. I turned to Selena. Her face had gone completely white, the color draining out of it in real time. "What?" she whispered. "That's not possible." That was the moment everything I thought I knew about my life stopped being true. I need to back up because none of this makes sense unless you understand who Grant, Wesley, and Preston actually were to me, and how long they'd been building toward a moment like this one. I'm 31 now, but I was 8 the first time I understood what it meant to be afraid of my own family. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I grew up in Millbrook, a small town 40 minutes outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where my father Roy worked as a plant supervisor and my mother Carol taught 4th grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from our house. We weren't rich. We weren't poor either. We were the kind of family that had a station wagon and a above-ground pool and went to church every other Sunday, mostly for my grandmother's sake. My grandmother Ruth was the center of everything. She lived at 4127 Larkspur Lane, the house where I would later stand in that driveway watching my future disappear. Every major holiday happened there. Every summer reunion happened there. She had 4 children. My father Roy was the oldest. Then came my Aunt Denise, then my Uncle Victor, then my Aunt Pam, who moved to Ohio and mostly stayed out of the family drama by geography alone. Aunt Denise had 3 sons. Grant was the oldest, 2 years ahead of me. Wesley was exactly my age, born 4 months apart, which our grandmother thought was adorable and used as an excuse to force us together at every gathering for the rest of our childhoods. Preston was the youngest, 18 months behind me. Denise's husband, my Uncle Frank Halloway, was a police sergeant in Millbrook. So was Wesley's godfather, Denise's brother-in-law. Between the two of them, half the department owed Denise a favor, or a beer, or a blind eye. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I don't think Grant, Wesley, and Preston were born cruel. I think they were raised in a house where cruelty got rewarded with laughter, where Denise thought their behavior was charming, where being boys excused things that should never have been excused. By the time they were teenagers, they'd learned that hurting me specifically was a kind of family entertainment, something that made the adults chuckle and shake their heads instead of intervene. The scooter incident happened when I was 8, at a 4th of July barbecue at Larkspur Lane. Grant and Wesley took turns riding their scooters directly into the back of my ankles while I stood near the food table, laughing every time I yelped. By the 3rd pass, I was bleeding through my sock. When I told my mother, Denise waved it off. "They're just playing," she said. "You're too sensitive." I was 8 years old and bleeding, and I was the problem. The pepper incident happened at my 13th birthday, October 9th, 2008. My grandmother had made the cake herself, and Wesley had somehow gotten hold of ghost pepper extract from a hot sauce competition his father had judged. He dosed my slice while I was blowing out candles. I remember the first bite, the way my whole mouth caught fire, the way I started crying in front of 20 relatives while Grant filmed it on a flip phone. My father told me to stop making a scene. That phrase would follow me for the next 18 years. By high school, the cruelty had a different shape. Sophomore year, I dated a girl named Kayla Preston. No relation to my cousin, just a coincidence of names that used to make us laugh before it stopped being funny. Grant, a senior senior by then, started talking to her behind my back. Then Wesley did too. By spring, they were passing her between the two of them like a possession, and they made sure I knew it, sending me photos of the three of them at parties I hadn't been invited to. When I confronted Grant, he shrugged and said, "She was never that into you anyway." My grandmother's response, when I brought it up at Thanksgiving that year, was that family shouldn't fight over girls, as if the problem was the fighting and not the betrayal. The incident that should have ended everything happened 4 years ago, the Christmas after I turned 27. We were all at Larkspur Lane. Preston, by then 25, and working at his father's precinct as a records clerk, had gotten hold of something, I still don't know what exactly, some kind of powder that dissolved clean in eggnog. I remember 3 sips. I remember laughing at something that wasn't funny. I remember waking up on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning with a headache like a spike through my skull, and my phone buzzing with notifications. Preston had posted a video of me from earlier that night, slurring, stumbling, saying things I don't remember saying, captioned, "Family reunion is lit this year." 40 people had already seen it by the time I found it. I filed a police report the next week. Officer Danny Wren took my statement, nodded along, told me he'd look into it. Officer Wren was Uncle Frank's partner. Nothing ever came of it. When I brought it up at the next family gathering, my grandmother told me I was tearing the family apart over a joke that went a little too far. My own father told me to let it go, that Preston had already apologized, though I never once heard an actual apology come out of Preston's mouth. What I heard, standing in the kitchen at Larkspur Lane, was Preston telling Grant, low enough that he thought I couldn't hear, "He never learns." There's one more incident from that stretch of years I have to mention, because it shaped how I understood my grandmother specifically, not just my cousins. When I was 16, I saved $800 from a summer job bagging groceries at the Millbrook IGA. Money I was putting toward a used car so I could stop relying on my father's schedule to get anywhere. Grant, 19 at the time and freshly enrolled in community college, asked to borrow it, promising to pay it back within a month once his financial aid came through. I said yes, mostly because saying no to Grant had never once gone well for me. The money never came back. When I brought it up to my grandmother, hoping she'd at least acknowledge it, she told me that family didn't keep score, that Grant was figuring himself out, and that I should be proud I could help. I never got the car that summer. Grant bought a set of rims for the truck his parents had already gotten him for his birthday. I think about that $800 sometimes, not because of the money itself, but because it was the clearest early proof I had that in that family, the rules only ever ran one direction. That was the family I came from. That was the town I grew up in. And into the middle of all of it, 3 years ago, I brought Selena. I met Selena at a coffee shop near State, the university where I'd gone for my engineering degree, and where, coincidentally, she'd finished her nursing program 2 years after me. It was a Tuesday morning, September 4th, and I remember the exact drink she ordered, because it became a running joke between us for the next 2 years. An oat milk latte with an extra shot because nursing school broke something in my brain that only caffeine can fix. We talked for 40 minutes before either of us admitted we were both late for other things. Selena grew up in Danville, about 90 minutes from Millbrook, raised by her mother Renata alone. She never talked much about her father, and I never pushed, because I understood what it was like to have parts of your family history you'd rather not excavate in public. She was 29 when we met, working nights at Harrisburg General in the cardiac unit, funny in a dry, understated way that took people a few conversations to catch on to. She noticed things. She remembered the names of people I'd mentioned once, months earlier. She was, without question, the best thing that had happened to me in a decade, defined mostly by disappointment. For the first year, I kept her away from my family on purpose. I told her it was because of scheduling, because of her shifts, because Millbrook was a long drive. The truth was I didn't want her anywhere near Grant, Wesley, and Preston. I didn't want the version of me that existed in that town, small and humiliated and 8 years old again, anywhere near the version of me she'd fallen in love with. I kept my world separate the way you keep oil and water separate, and for a long time it worked. By our second year together, the separation had started to feel like a lie by omission. Selena asked, gently but repeatedly, why she'd never met my parents, why I flinched every time my phone rang with a Millbrook area code, why I came back from the rare visit home looking like something had been extracted from me. I told her eventually, some of it, not all of it. I told her about difficult cousins, about a family that could be a lot. I didn't tell her about the pepper cake or the video or the scooters, because some of it sounded too small to explain, and some of it sounded too big to say out loud. I had a ring hidden in my sock drawer by then. I'd bought it in March, from a jeweler in Harrisburg, $1,100 I'd been saving toward since the previous fall. I was planning to propose in July, at the overlook off Route 15, where we'd had our first real date. I hadn't told anyone, not my mother, not my sister Jenna, who I was closest to in my whole family, and who I trusted more than anyone else in Millbrook. I wanted it to be just ours, at least until it happened. The reunion invitation had arrived 3 weeks before the 14th. My grandmother sent them every June, gold trim on cream cardstock, a tradition she'd kept since I was a child. I hadn't planned to bring Selena. I'd told her honestly that I was still working up to it, that I wanted a few more months before I threw her into the deep end of my family. She'd said she understood. She'd never once pushed, which is exactly why, standing in that backyard, watching her pull an identical invitation out of her purse, addressed to her personally at her apartment, inviting her to come meet everyone. I felt something in my chest go completely hollow. Someone had reached into my life, taken the one thing I was protecting, and detonated it on purpose. And I already knew, before Grant even opened his mouth, exactly who had the access, the motive, and the cruelty to do it. I want to walk you through how it escalated that day, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one worse than the last. Each one something I told myself couldn't possibly get worse, right up until it did. The first stage was denial. When Selena showed me the invitation, my first instinct wasn't rage, it was disbelief. I actually laughed, a short, ugly sound, and said, that has to be a mistake. Maybe my grandmother sent extra invitations. I told myself this because the alternative, that someone in my family had specifically targeted the one relationship I'd kept safe from them, was too big to process standing in a backyard full of people. Selena didn't look convinced. It has my name on it, she said, personally. It says, we can't wait for you to finally meet the family. You've been the missing piece. Who would write that if it wasn't real? I looked past her toward the garage, where the laughing hadn't stopped, and the second stage started. I walked over, and Grant, seeing my face, straightened up and put on this performance of innocence I'd seen 100 times before. Whoa, calm down, man. We didn't do anything. Then why are you filming? I said. It's a family reunion. We film everything. Wesley chimed in, all faux concerned. Is everything okay with you two? You seem tense. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for one disorienting second I almost doubted my own read of the situation. That was the tactic. That was always the tactic. Make the reaction look like the problem instead of the thing that caused it. The third stage was when my aunt got involved. Denise came out of the house with a pitcher of sweet tea like nothing was happening, saw the tension, and immediately took her son's side without asking a single question. Whatever's going on, can we not do this in front of everyone? Your grandmother worked hard on this. I said, Denise, someone sent Selena a fake invitation to embarrass me. Denise didn't even blink. Maybe she just misread the details. People make mistakes. Selena, standing 3 feet away, holding the actual physical evidence in her hand, said nothing, just looked at me like she was watching me disappear into a family that would rather protect a lie than face a truth. The fourth stage was the weaponizing of my father. Roy came out from the garage area where he'd been talking to Uncle Frank, and instead of asking what was wrong, he went straight to managing optics. Can we keep our voices down? People are staring. I said, people should be staring, Dad. Something is genuinely wrong here. He put his hand on my shoulder, the same gesture he'd used since I was 8, to signal that the conversation was over whether I agreed or not. You're embarrassing your mother. I looked at my mother, Carol, standing near the dessert table, and she wasn't looking at me at all. She was looking at Denise, some silent negotiation passing between them that I wasn't part of and never had been. The fifth stage, the one that broke the ceiling completely, was when Preston narrated it. He'd kept filming through all of this, and now he leaned toward the camera and said, in this mock documentary voice that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. And here we see the subject beginning to realize something isn't right. Classic reaction. That was when I shoved Grant into the garage door. That was when the words came out. You're dating your own cousin. I need to tell you what that revelation actually meant, and how it connects to a detail I hadn't thought about in years until that exact moment. 2 years earlier, at a 4th of July gathering, Uncle Victor had gotten drunker than I'd ever seen him. He wasn't a big drinker normally, quiet, kept to himself, worked as an insurance adjuster in Reading, and drove 90 minutes to Millbrook for holidays out of obligation more than enthusiasm. That night, though, he'd had 5 or 6 beers by sunset, and I remember him sitting alone on the back porch steps while the fireworks went off down the street, saying something to nobody in particular. I made a mistake a long time ago. Biggest one of my life. Nobody knows. I remember thinking it was strange, filing it away the way you file away things that don't fully make sense in the moment, and then forgetting about it completely until Wesley pulled out his phone in that backyard and showed me a photograph. It was a woman who looked exactly like Selena, 23 years older, standing next to my Uncle Victor outside a bar called The Junction in Danville. Then he scrolled to a second image, a birth certificate, Selena's name, Selena's date of birth, and under the word father, a signature I recognized immediately, because I'd watched Uncle Victor sign checks at every family gathering for 30 years. Your mom had an affair with Uncle Victor 23 years ago, Preston said, still holding the camera, proud of himself in a way that made my stomach turn. Dad told us drunk one night, so we looked you up, found out you went to state, same as our favorite cousin. Grant grinned wider, blood still on his lip. We made fake dating profiles, matched you two on purpose, sent you to the same coffee shop, same time, even got Owen's roommate to invite you both to that party where you actually met in person. My legs went weak. 2 years. A ring hidden in my sock drawer. I was going to propose next month at an overlook we'd chosen together without knowing it had ever been chosen for us. This is sick, I screamed, and my voice broke apart on the second word. Nobody moved. 30 relatives just watched us like a show they'd already paid the price of admission for. Selena made a sound like a wounded animal, something between a gasp and a sob, and then she was running for the house, sobbing so hard her whole body shook with it. I ran after her. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back to the video. She'd already locked herself in the downstairs bathroom by the time I reached the kitchen. My Aunt Denise stood outside the door with her arms crossed, and I want to be honest about what her face looked like in that moment, because I've replayed it 100 times since. She wasn't horrified. She wasn't even uncomfortable. She was almost smiling, this small, satisfied twitch at the corner of her mouth, like a woman watching a plan come together exactly the way she'd hoped. The boys were just having some fun, she said, like I'd walked in on a prank involving a whoopee cushion and not the demolition of my entire life. I pounded on the door. Selena, please, let me in. Her voice came back broken, barely audible over the water running in the sink, like she was trying to wash something off that wouldn't come off. Go away. The lock clicked louder, like she wanted me to hear it engage. My father appeared behind me in the hallway, and instead of concern, his face carried something closer to irritation. The specific irritation of a man who has spent his whole life more embarrassed by conflict than by the things that cause it. Stop making a scene, he said. Those exact words. The same 4 words he'd used when I was 13 and crying over a pepper cake. I hadn't just watched my life detonate in front of 30 people. Apparently I was also supposed to clean it up quietly. Uncle Victor stepped out of the downstairs bedroom then, pale in a way I'd never seen on him. The kind of pale that comes from finally being caught after 23 years of managing not to be. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked instead at the hallway runner, at his own shoes, at anything that wasn't my face. Is it true? I demanded, my voice louder than I meant it to be, loud enough that I heard footsteps gathering in the kitchen behind me. An audience assembling for round 2. Is Selena your daughter? He nodded, once without looking up. It happened a long time ago, he said, like the passage of time was the thing that mattered here, and not the woman locked in a bathroom 12 feet away, sobbing into a hand towel because she'd just learned her boyfriend was her half-brother. It happened a long time ago is a sentence I've thought about constantly since. It's the sentence people use when they want forgiveness for something they were never planning to confess. Something in my chest exploded. I shoved him into the porch railing so hard he barely caught himself against the wood, his hand slipping once before it held. Behind me, I could hear Wesley and Preston still filming from the hallway. Preston narrating again in that same mock documentary voice, low enough that he probably thought I couldn't hear it over my own shouting. And here we see the moment of realization really sinking in. I turned and lunged at them, both of them, and I don't fully remember the next several seconds except that my father grabbed me from behind with both arms, and 2 of my uncles ran in to help hold me back, and it took all 3 of them, 3 grown men, to keep me off my own cousins, which tells you something about how far past reasonable I'd gone, and also, I think now, something about how much force it actually takes to restrain a person who has finally stopped absorbing everything quietly. The bathroom door finally opened maybe 10 minutes later. Selena walked out with my Aunt Denise gripping her elbow like she was escorting a patient out of a hospital room, not comforting her, just managing her, moving her toward an exit. Mascara had streaked down both cheeks in long gray lines. She refused to look at me. She walked straight past me toward the front door, and I followed her out onto the lawn, past relatives who parted around us like we were something contagious. Selena, wait, please. She just kept shaking her head, whispering the same 2 words over and over, quiet enough that I had to lean in to hear them at all. I can't. She got into her car, a gray Civic with a parking pass from Harrisburg General still hanging off the mirror, and she locked the doors before I even reached the driver's side window. She backed out of the driveway without once looking at me, and I stood there on the gravel shoulder of Larkspur Lane and watched her taillights disappear around the bend toward Route 15, toward the overlook I'd never gotten the chance to take her to. I stood in that driveway watching my whole future disappear down the street, and behind me, I could still hear my grandmother's voice cutting through the silence of 30 stunned relatives who had, apparently, all known enough to keep their mouths shut. Family business stays in the family, she said, loud enough to carry like she was closing a chapter and moving on to dessert. You never should have brought that girl around here. I didn't say anything back to her. I didn't have anything left. I got in my own car and drove home to the apartment Selena and I shared on the east side of Harrisburg, and I sat on the edge of our bed for close to 2 hours without moving, staring at the sock drawer where the ring still sat in its box. That night, my phone buzzed at midnight. One message forwarded from Selena's roommate, a woman named Mia who I'd met maybe 4 times and who had never had much reason to contact me directly. 5 words that told me everything and nothing. She's not answering. Check on her. And when I opened the photo attached underneath it, my stomach dropped straight through the floor because it wasn't a picture of Selena at all. It was a photograph of an empty pill bottle sitting on the bathroom counter of Selena's apartment, half the contents missing, and Mia's message underneath it, typed in a panic. Found this when I got home. She's not picking up. I'm calling 911. Get here. I don't remember most of the drive to Denton Street. I remember running red lights. I remember my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I remember praying to a God I hadn't spoken to since I was a teenager, bargaining in the specific desperate way you bargain when you understand, for the first time in your life, what it means to actually lose someone. By the time I got there, an ambulance was already parked outside, lights turning silently against the brick of the building. Mia met me at the door, her face gray with fear, and she told me the paramedics had gotten to her in time, that she'd taken enough to be seriously sick, but not not enough to kill her, that the timing had worked out barely, because Mia had come home early from a double shift that was supposed to run until 2 in the morning. I sat in the hospital waiting room at Harrisburg General, the same hospital where Selena worked, being looked at by nurses who recognized her name and asked me quietly what had happened, and I didn't have an answer that made any sense out loud. She was admitted for 2 days. Her mother, Renata, drove up from Danville that same night, and when she walked into the waiting room and saw me sitting there, her face did something I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't anger. It was recognition, immediate and total, like she'd been waiting 23 years for a conversation she'd hoped would never have to happen. "You're the boyfriend," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She sat down 2 chairs away, not next to me, not far from me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Then she said very quietly, "I need to tell you what actually happened, because I think whatever you heard today was probably twisted into something uglier than the truth, and I think you deserve the truth, even now, especially now." What Renata told me that night in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning rewired everything I thought I understood about the day that had just ended. "I did have a relationship with Victor," she said, folding her hands in her lap like she'd rehearsed this 100 times over the years and never once expected to actually say it out loud. 24 years ago. It lasted about 2 months. He wasn't married yet, but he was seeing a woman named Paula on and off, and things between them were complicated. It was a mess. I'm not proud of it, but it ended before I even knew I was pregnant. She told me the timeline in careful, exact pieces, the way people do when they've gone over something in their heads so many times the facts have worn smooth like river stones. She'd been seeing another man that same summer, a man named Marcus Ferreira, on and off, and the timing between the 2 relationships overlapped by just enough weeks that when she found out she was pregnant, she genuinely didn't know which of them was the father. She told Victor as much, because she believed he deserved to know it was possible. Victor, panicked and already trying to repair things with Paula, begged her to keep it quiet until they knew for sure. "We did a paternity test," Renata said. "Back then, it wasn't as simple as it is now, but there was a clinic in Harrisburg that could run it. It came back negative. Victor was not Selena's father. Marcus was." She looked at me steadily when she said it, like she needed me to understand this wasn't a story she was constructing on the spot to save her daughter, but something she'd carried, documented, and never had a reason to bring up again. Marcus stayed around for a few years. Selena has memories of him, faint ones, from when she was very small. He died in a car accident on Route 22 when she was 9. I never remarried. I never told her much about any of it because there wasn't much good to tell. I sat there in a plastic hospital chair, trying to reconcile what she was saying with the birth certificate Wesley had shown me hours earlier, the one with Victor's signature under the word father. "There's a document," I said. "They had a birth certificate. It had his name on it." Renata's face changed then, something sharpening behind her eyes. "That's not possible," she said. "Selena's birth certificate has Marcus's name on it. I have the original at home. I can show you tomorrow if you want to drive down." I asked her the question that had been circling my head since the backyard. "Then how did Victor know to say yes when I asked him if it was true?" Renata was quiet for a moment. "Because Victor has spent 24 years terrified that someone would find out about the affair itself, not the paternity. The affair. He told his sister once, drunk years ago, some version of the story, probably an incomplete one, and I'd bet money he never corrected whatever version made it around that family afterward, because the correction would have required admitting the affair happened at all. It was easier for him to let people believe the wrong, worse thing than to say the true embarrassing thing out loud. That was the moment the porch memory came back to me whole. 2 summers ago, Uncle Victor sitting on the steps at Larkspur Lane while fireworks cracked overhead, half drunk, telling nobody in particular. I made a mistake a long time ago, biggest one of my life, nobody knows. I'd assumed, standing in that backyard hours earlier, that he was confessing to fathering a child he'd hidden for 2 decades. He hadn't been. He'd been confessing to an affair he'd never told his wife about, one he'd spent 24 years managing through silence. And when his nephews cornered him with half a rumor and a demand for the truth, he'd taken the coward's route one more time. He'd nodded along to a lie because the lie was less humiliating than the truth underneath it. I asked Renata the only question that actually mattered by that point. "Do you have the real paternity test? The real birth certificate? Something I can actually show people?" She nodded slowly. "I kept everything. I always thought someday Selena might want to know the whole story on her own terms. I never imagined it would come out like this." She paused, and for the first time that night, her composure cracked slightly. "I need you to understand something. Whatever those boys did today, they didn't do it with the truth. They did it with a rumor they never bothered to verify, because verifying it would have gotten in the way of hurting you as badly as possible." Selena was discharged 2 days later, on a Thursday, pale and quiet, and not yet ready to speak to me beyond short, careful sentences. I didn't push. I drove Renata to her house in Danville that same week, and she handed me a manila folder that had clearly been kept somewhere safe for over 2 decades, the paper gone soft and yellowed at the corners. Inside was the real birth certificate, Marcus Ferreira's name typed clean under father, dated the year Selena was born. Behind it was a photocopy of a lab report from a clinic that no longer existed, dated the same year, showing a paternity exclusion for a man named Victor Halloway. I sat at Renata's kitchen table and read both documents twice, and something something that had been a hole in my chest since the reunion started, slowly, to fill back in with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite rage, but sat somewhere close to both. I knew what I had to do with it. I wasn't interested in quietly absorbing this the way I'd absorbed everything else in that family for 23 years. I was going to bring it back to Larkspur Lane myself. I called my grandmother 2 days later and told her I needed to come by, alone, and talk to the family. She sounded surprised, maybe even hopeful, like she assumed this was me coming to smooth things over the way I always had before. I let her believe that. I wanted everyone there. I told her to invite Denise's family too, since apparently we still had unfinished business. I drove to Millbrook on a Sunday afternoon in late June, the folder sitting on the passenger seat like something radioactive. Denise, Grant, Wesley, and Preston were already there when I arrived, along with my parents, my sister Jenna, and Uncle Victor, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. My grandmother sat in her usual armchair near the window, the same chair she'd occupied at every family gathering of my entire life, and for the first time I can remember, I didn't feel small walking into that living room. I want to show everyone something, I said, before anyone could offer me tea or ask how Selena was doing in that performative, hollow way that wasn't really a question. I laid the birth certificate on the coffee table, then the paternity exclusion report beside it. This is Selena's actual birth certificate. Her father was a man named Marcus Ferreira. He died when she was 9. This is a paternity test from 24 years ago that proves Uncle Victor is not her biological father. It never was him. It was never even close to being him. The room went silent in a completely different way than the backyard had gone silent 3 weeks earlier. That silence had been gleeful. 30 people waiting for a punchline. This silence was the sound of a story collapsing in real time, of people realizing the thing they'd used to justify their cruelty had never been true to begin with. Grant was the first to speak, and even then, even with 2 documents sitting on the table in front of him, his instinct was to minimize. Okay, but we didn't know that. We found what we found. You found a rumor, I said. You found half a sentence your father said drunk one night, and instead of asking a single question, instead of considering for 1 second that you might be wrong, you built an entire plan around it. You matched us on dating apps. You orchestrated our first meeting. You spent months planning a moment specifically designed to make 2 people believe they'd been sleeping with a sibling for 2 years, and you didn't check if it was even true. You didn't care if it was true. You just wanted it to hurt. Wesley tried a different angle, the one they always tried, turning the conversation back toward my behavior instead of theirs. You're the one who assaulted Grant and Uncle Victor in front of the whole family. Maybe you should be apologizing. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. Selena tried to kill herself 2 nights ago, I said, and I watched the words land across the room like something physical. Watched my mother's hand fly up to her mouth. Watched my grandmother's face go slack for the first time in my entire life. She's alive because her roommate came home early. She spent 2 days in a hospital bed because your fake dating profile experiment worked exactly the way you wanted it to. So no, I'm not going to apologize for shoving you into a garage door. Nobody in that living room had a joke left in them after that. Preston, who'd narrated our entire humiliation like a documentary host 3 weeks earlier, sat very still on the arm of the couch, his phone nowhere in sight for the first time all summer. Denise's face had gone through several stages in under a minute. Disbelief, then something that looked almost like fear, and finally a kind of brittle defensiveness that came out sideways. They're 26, 29, 31 years old, she said. You can't blame me for what they do. I'm not blaming you for what they do, I said. I'm blaming you for what you've spent 30 years teaching them was funny. My grandmother spoke then, for the first time since I'd laid the documents on the table, and her voice had none of its usual command in it. Victor, she said, is this true? Is any of this true? Victor had been sitting on the far end of the couch, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. The affair is true, he said. I had a 2-month relationship with Renata 24 years ago. It ended before Selena was even conceived, or right around then. We were never entirely sure of the exact timing, which is why we did the test. He gestured weakly at the paternity report on the table, like it was evidence in a trial he'd already lost. The test came back negative. I am not her father. I never was. I told Denise a version of it years ago, drunk, and I never corrected whatever she assumed after that, because correcting it meant admitting the affair to Paula, and I was a coward, and I let that rumor sit out there for years because it was easier than telling the truth. You let your nephews build a plan to destroy 2 people's lives over something you knew wasn't real, I said. Victor didn't argue. I didn't know what they were planning, he said. I swear to God I didn't know. Denise cornered me about it a few weeks ago, asked me point blank if it was true, and I panicked and told her yes because it felt smaller than telling her the actual truth. I didn't think anyone would do anything with it. I was wrong. I was so wrong, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life sorry for it. I believed that part, actually. Victor's cowardice had created the conditions, but Grant, Wesley, and Preston had built the weapon and pulled the trigger themselves, adding the forged detail of the fake signature, adding the months of engineering our meeting, adding the invitation sent to Selena's actual apartment. Victor's silence had been the crack in the dam. My cousins had been the ones who found it and blew the whole thing open on purpose. My grandmother sat very still in her armchair for a long moment, looking at the documents on the table like she was trying to make them mean something other than what they meant. Then she she looked at Denise's sons, one at a time, Grant, then Wesley, then Preston, and said something I never in my life expected to hear come out of her mouth. "Get out of my house!" Denise stood up immediately, outraged on their behalf the way she always had been, always would be. "Mom, you can't be serious. This is a misunderstanding. Everybody's emotional." "I am completely serious," my grandmother said, and her voice had found its command again, sharper now than I'd ever heard it. "I have spent 30 years watching these boys hurt that child." She nodded toward me, and I don't think I'd been called a child in that house in over a decade, and every single time I told myself it was normal cousin nonsense, that it would work itself out, that families are messy and boys are rough and none of it meant anything. I was wrong. I have been wrong for 30 years, and I am done being wrong. Get out of my house. Nobody moved for a few seconds, the specific stunned non-movement of people watching an earthquake happen in a room they'd assumed was structurally sound forever. My mother finally spoke, her voice thin. "I didn't know it was this bad. I want to say that out loud. I didn't know, and I should have known, because you told me pieces of it for years, and I let myself believe they were smaller than they were. It wasn't the apology I'd needed at 13 or at 27, but it landed differently arriving in front of the people who'd caused the damage instead of privately, later in a kitchen where nobody else could hear it." Then Grant stood up first, his jaw tight, and said the only thing that made any real sense as a closing statement for a person like him. "Fine, enjoy your family, I guess." He said it like a threat, like a door being slammed, and I watched him walk out with Wesley and Preston trailing behind, Preston pausing at the doorway just long enough to look back at me with something that might have been the first genuine flicker of guilt I'd ever seen on his face, and might just as easily have been the calculation of a man realizing, for the first time, that there might finally be consequences. The consequences, once they started, didn't stay contained to that living room. Word moves fast in a town like Millbrook, faster still through a family with 3 police officers connected to it by blood or marriage, and within a week the story had split into 2 competing versions, circulating through group chats and church parking lots and the diner on Main Street where half my extended family had breakfast on Saturdays. My sister Jenna became the first real ally I had in any of this. She was 28, married with a 2-year-old, and she'd always existed slightly outside the worst of the cousin dynamics because she was a girl, and Grant, Wesley, and Preston had never bothered targeting her the way they targeted me. She called me the night after the living room confrontation and said, without preamble, "I believe you. I've believed you since we were kids, and nobody else would say it out loud. I'm sorry it took this to get me to actually do something." She started showing up to things differently after that, sitting next to me instead of near Denise's side of the family, at the few gatherings that still happened, correcting people in real time when they tried to soften what Grant, Wesley, and Preston had done into boys being boys or a prank that went too far. My Aunt Pam, the one who'd moved to Ohio decades earlier, specifically to get some distance from the family theater, called me from Columbus and said she'd heard 3 different versions of the story before she called to get the real one from me. When I told her the actual sequence of events, she was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I left partly because of exactly this kind of thing. I'm sorry you didn't have the option to leave until it got this bad." It wasn't a grand gesture, just a phone call, but it mattered more than I expected it to. The legal complications arrived faster than I anticipated. Preston, it turned out, had used his access as a records clerk at his father's precinct to pull an old, unrelated document template that he and Grant had digitally altered to fabricate the birth certificate they'd shown Selena and me in the backyard, inserting Victor's actual signature, which they'd lifted from an old insurance form Victor had once left at Larkspur Lane. When that detail came out, through Jenna, who'd heard it secondhand from a cousin still speaking to Preston, it meant the fabricated document wasn't just a cruel prank. It was evidence tampering using government resources, a fact that put Preston's job, and potentially his freedom, in real jeopardy. Selena's employment lawyer, a woman named Carla Whitfield, who Renata had recommended after hearing the whole story, told us plainly that we had grounds to pursue charges for harassment for the fabricated document, and separately, civilly, for the emotional distress that had led directly to Selena's hospitalization. Selena and I talked about it for weeks before deciding what to do. She didn't want a courtroom. She didn't want depositions, didn't want to spend a year of her life explaining to strangers why she'd swallowed a bottle of pills in her bathroom. What she wanted, in the end, was for Preston to lose the job that had given him access to fabricate a legal document in the first place, and for there to be an official record somewhere that what happened to us had actually happened, in case either of my cousins ever tried it on anyone else. We filed a report with the county, not the local department where Preston's father and Wesley's godfather worked, specifically to avoid the kind of quiet burial my earlier complaints had always met. The county investigator, a woman with no ties to Millbrook at all, took the case seriously in a way local law enforcement never had. Preston was placed on administrative leave within 2 weeks and terminated by early September, once the internal review confirmed the document had come from his workstation. Uncle Victor's marriage didn't survive the summer either. Paula found out everything within days, not from Victor directly, but from Denise, who apparently decided that if her sons were going to be blamed for the fallout, Victor's original sin deserved equal exposure. Paula moved out of their house on Grantham Court by the end of July. I heard secondhand hand that Victor tried to explain the difference between the affair and the false paternity claim, tried to argue that at least the biology had never been true, and that this distinction meant less to Paula than he seemed to think it would. I felt something complicated when I heard that, not quite sympathy, but not nothing either. Victor's cowardice had lit the fuse. He hadn't built the bomb, but you don't get full credit for not building something you were perfectly willing to let explode. My relationship with my own parents took longer to sort through, and honestly, some of it never fully did. My father called me twice that August, both times circling the same territory. Some version of, can't we just move past this, which I'd come to understand wasn't an offer of reconciliation so much as a request that I go back to being quiet again. I told him the second time as calmly as I could manage that I loved him, that I didn't hate him, but that I needed him to understand something had shifted permanently in me, and that I wasn't available anymore for the role I'd played in that family for 23 years, the role of the one who absorbed things so everyone else could keep having a nice time. My mother, to her credit, came around faster. She drove to Harrisburg alone in early August, sat in our kitchen, and cried for a long time before she said anything at all. I should have believed you when you were 8 years old and bleeding on your grandmother's driveway, she said. I've been trying to figure out how to say that for 23 years and I never found a good enough moment. I don't think there is one. I'm sorry anyway. My grandmother, in the strangest turn of the whole summer, became one of the people I heard from most. She called every week, sometimes just to talk about nothing, the garden, a recipe, a show she was watching, and I understood those calls for what they were. An old woman trying to build back in small pieces, 30 years of looking away. She never fully explained why it took the threat of losing a granddaughter-in-law to a suicide attempt to finally see what had been happening under her own roof for 3 decades. I didn't ask her to explain it. Some repairs don't need an audit. They just need to keep happening, one phone call at a time, and you decide slowly whether to let them. One of the more unexpected allies that summer was a cousin on Denise's side I'd barely spoken to growing up. Her husband's nephew, a guy named Dean, who'd always sat on the periphery of family gatherings the same way I had, never quite trusted enough to be let all the way in, never quite an outsider either. Dean called me in July out of nowhere and told me he'd watched Grant, Wesley, and Preston target other people over the years too, smaller versions of what they'd done to me, and that he'd never said anything because he assumed nobody would believe him over 3 cops' sons. Watching you actually bring receipts changed something for me, he said. I should have said something a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't. He became, unexpectedly, one of the people I trusted most out of that entire extended family by the end of the year. Proof that the family I'd been grieving had at least 1 or 2 decent branches I'd simply never had a reason to climb toward before. Jenna, meanwhile, became something closer to a translator between the 2 halves of the family that summer. The half that had finally started asking real questions, and the half that still wanted the whole thing to quietly disappear back into gossip and casserole dishes. She was the one who told me gently when my father was struggling more than he let on in his phone calls. She was the one who made sure I heard about the wedding invitation list debates secondhand, instead of finding out through some cousin's Instagram story the way I'd found out about half my own humiliations over the years. Having one person in that family whose loyalty I never had to question again turned out to matter more than I expected. A small, steady counterweight to everyone else I was still learning how much distance to keep. Grant and Wesley faced softer consequences than Preston, mostly social ones. Those social consequences in a town the size of Millbrook carry more weight than people from bigger places tend to understand. Wesley worked at his father-in-law's contracting business, and word of what he'd done reached several of the company's clients through the same gossip network that had once protected the family, now working against it instead. He lost at least 2 contracts that summer that I know of. Grant simply disappeared from most family channels entirely, block by block, unfriended from group chats, uninvited from the smaller gatherings that continued at Larkspur Lane without him. I don't know what either of them thinks about alone, when the audience that used to laugh at their cruelty isn't there to perform for anymore. I've stopped wondering. It isn't my job to carry that curiosity for them. There was a quiet grief underneath all of it that I didn't expect, and that I think surprised me more than the anger had. I mourned the family I thought I had, the one where a birthday cake was just a cake and a scooter was just a toy, and a grandmother's love didn't have exceptions built into it depending on which grandchild was bleeding. I sat in our apartment one night in late August, alone, Selena still staying at her mother's for a stretch while she finished the harder parts of her recovery, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since I was 8 years old on that driveway. Not for Grant or Wesley or Preston, for the version of Sunday afternoons I'd wanted my whole life and never actually gotten, the one where everyone at that table was rooting for me instead of watching to see how much I could take. Selena and I didn't rush back toward each other, and I think that was the only reason we made it back at all. She spent 6 weeks at Renata's house in Danville after her discharge, seeing a therapist twice a week, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who specialized, coincidentally or not, in trauma involving family betrayal. I drove down on Sundays, not to push anything, just to sit on Renata's back porch with her for an hour or two, sometimes talking, sometimes not. The first few visits she could barely look at me, not because she blamed me, she told me later, but because looking at me meant remembering the exact moment she'd believed, for close to 90 seconds in that backyard, that 2 years of her life had been built on on something monstrous. It took a long time for her nervous system to stop flinching at my face. We got a real DNA test done, both of us, in early July. Not because either of us doubted Renata's documents anymore, but because Dr. Okafor suggested it might help Selena's body catch up to what her mind already knew was true. The results came back exactly as expected. No relation. I remember Selena reading the report in Renata's kitchen, setting it down on the table and saying quietly, "I already knew. I just needed to see it typed out by somebody with no reason to lie to me." I understood that completely. Some truths you need twice. Once from someone who loves you, and once from a machine that has no opinion about you at all. There were logistical costs to all of it that nobody warns you about when a family implodes in a single afternoon. Selena's medical bills from the hospitalization ran just over $4,000 after insurance, a number that sat between us for a while, like something neither of us wanted to be the one to bring up first. I paid half without being asked. She let me, which I understood as its own small act of trust rebuilding itself in real time. We broke our apartment lease early that October, 6 months before it was set to expire, paying an $1,100 penalty to get out of a space that had started to feel less like a home and more like the last place either of us had felt uncomplicated. We moved into a smaller place on the north side of Harrisburg, further from both Millbrook and Denton Street, close enough to Selena's hospital that her commute got easier, far enough from everything else that neither of us had to drive past anywhere that reminded us of that June. The ring stayed in its box for a long time. I'd bought it for a version of a proposal that no longer made sense, an overlook I couldn't picture either of us standing at without also picturing everything that had happened in between. I didn't propose that July. I didn't propose that fall either. I waited and I let Selena set whatever pace her recovery actually needed, instead of the pace I'd originally planned around a date on a calendar that meant nothing to her anymore. Dr. Okafor, in one of the few sessions I sat in on with Selena's permission, said something that stuck with both of us. She said trust, once it's been detonated by people outside a relationship, doesn't rebuild itself by pretending the explosion didn't happen. It rebuilds by both people agreeing, slowly and out loud, on what's actually true, and then choosing, repeatedly, to act like it. Selena and I spent the better part of a year doing exactly that. Slow dinners, careful conversations. A weekend trip to the coast in April where neither of us mentioned Millbrook once on purpose, just to prove to ourselves we still knew how to exist together without a crisis organizing the conversation. Preston's case moved through the county system slowly, the way these things do. He pleaded to a reduced charge that October, tampering with a government record, and received 18 months probation, along with the loss of any future eligibility for law enforcement or records work in the state. I heard he moved to Pittsburgh the following spring, taking a warehouse job, and I haven't heard anything about him since, which is, honestly, exactly the amount of information I want to have about Preston for the rest of my life. I proposed to Selena the following June, almost exactly a year after the reunion, though not at the Overlook off Route 15. We'd both quietly agreed, without ever fully saying it out loud, that the Overlook belonged to a version of us that hadn't survived that summer. Instead, I asked her on the back deck of the new apartment on an ordinary Tuesday evening. No restaurant, no audience, no relatives filming from a garage. Just the two of us, and a ring that had spent a year waiting in a drawer for a moment that finally felt earned instead of scheduled. She said yes before I'd even finished the sentence, which made both of us laugh in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, uncomplicated. We're married now, almost a year, living in that same apartment on the north side of Harrisburg. Selena transferred out of the cardiac unit at Harrisburg General into a pediatric floor, something she says feels lighter, less like watching adults' hearts finally give out, and more like watching kids get better. I switched jobs too, moved to an engineering firm in Camp Hill that has nothing to do with Millbrook, and nobody in it who's ever met a single member of my family. We still see Dr. Okafor occasionally, together now instead of separately, mostly maintenance at this point, tuning something that's mostly healed but still worth checking on. My relationship with my parents has settled into something smaller than it used to be, and I've made a kind of peace with that. We talk every couple of weeks. My mother visits more than my father does. We don't discuss Grant, Wesley, or Preston ever, an unspoken agreement that seems to work for everyone involved. My grandmother came to the wedding, sat in the second row, and cried through most of the ceremony in a way that felt, finally, like it was actually about us, and not about managing an image for the extended family. I've forgiven her more than I've forgiven my father, and I've thought a lot about why that is. I think it's because she eventually said the true thing out loud, in front of everyone, the day it mattered most. My father still hasn't, not fully, and I've stopped waiting for him to. Uncle Victor lives alone now in a smaller place outside Reading. We're not close, but we're not enemies either. He sent a card to the wedding with a check inside that I almost didn't cash, and then did, because refusing it felt like more energy than I wanted to spend on him at this point in my life. Renata came to the wedding too, sat with Selena's side, and it still strikes me sometimes how strange it is that the woman who could have been my mother-in-law under the worst possible circumstances ended up being one of the steadiest people in either of our lives once the truth finally got told properly. I think about that backyard a lot, more than I'd like to, honestly. I think about Selena's face going white, about the gold trim on that fake invitation, about 30 relatives standing around around like an audience at a play they already knew the ending to. For a long time, I thought the lesson of that day was about my cousins, about cruelty, about how far people will go when cruelty gets mistaken for entertainment for long enough. I don't think that's the real lesson anymore. The real lesson is quieter than that, and sadder, in a way. It's that silence, even well-meaning silence, even the kind that just wants everyone to get along and have a nice barbecue, builds the exact conditions cruelty needs to survive. My grandmother's silence, my father's silence, Victor's silence, most of all. None of them threw a single punch that day. All of them handed the people who did exactly what they needed to swing it. Selena asked me once, almost a year after the wedding, why I even bothered showing up to family things for so long. Given everything I'd told her by then about the scooters and the pepper cake and the video at Christmas, it was a fair question, and it took me a while to find an honest answer. I told her I kept showing up because some part of me was still 8 years old, still standing on that driveway, still hoping that if I just kept coming back, kept absorbing it, kept being the reasonable one, eventually somebody would finally choose me over the joke. Nobody did, not for 23 years. It took losing almost everything, and nearly losing her, for that particular hope to finally die where it belonged. I don't regret going to that reunion. I regret, if I'm honest, every reunion before it, the ones where I let it slide because making a scene felt worse than absorbing another humiliation, the ones where I told myself a bled ankle or a mouthful of fire or a video I never asked to star in were simply the price of admission for belonging somewhere. They were never the price of belonging. They were just the cost of staying quiet, and I paid it for 23 years before I finally stopped. But that last one, the one that finally broke everything open, I don't regret at all. Some doors only open because you're standing in the doorway when the whole structure finally gives way. I was standing in that driveway when it did. I watched a taillight disappear around a bend that night and thought I'd lost everything. What I actually lost was a family that had never really been mine to begin with, built on the kind of silence that only protects the people doing the harm. What I kept, in the end, was the one person who was never supposed to be part of the joke at all. Sometimes still, I catch myself bracing before family events, a leftover reflex from 23 years of learning to expect the ground to shift under me without warning. It happens less now. Most years now, the only family events I attend are small ones. My grandmother's birthday, Jenna's kids' school plays, quiet dinners with the handful of people who finally chose me back. I used to think a family reunion was supposed to prove you belonged somewhere. I understand it differently now. It's supposed to prove the people around the table are actually glad you came. For most of my life, at Larkspur Lane, they weren't. It just took me until I was 31, standing in a driveway watching taillights disappear, to finally let myself see it.